topic for today, which is building a 100 billion economy, how Zimbabwe can leverage diaspora. Our moderator for this topic is Hopewell Maua. He's a senior strategic analyst with Ernst & Young. Hopewell, hand it to you.
Yeah. Good day, everyone. Welcome back to the second panel discussion session. As Mr. Mzondo said, our topic today is Zimbabwe dreams of a 100 billion economy. How can the country leverage its diaspora? So let me start by introducing our panelists today. We've got Batanai Katongera, who is head of transfer pricing at McFarlane's. We've got Tauya Chipato, who is director at Tamsin Capital. We've got Dr. Rob Daniel, who is Deputy Trade Commissioner Africa at Department for International Trade. We've got Tafi Nyawanza, who is from Zimbabwe Diaspora Investment Group. So gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Shall we kick off straight away by starting with our first question? If we just go from Tauya there. Tauya, what are the conditions? What conditions would drive diaspora funds into Africa and Zimbabwe in particular?
Hi, my name is Tauya, and I'm from Tamsin Capital. So my focus is mainly on investing in agricultural value chains in Africa. So the business opportunity that we saw in 2010, 2011 was looking at farms that were lying fallow and hadn't been used, and working with the owners of the farms to either through a rental model or an ownership model to then go in and invest in those farms. So a lot of our investment came from Australian investors. I was based in Australia for 7 years, and so I managed to work with different Australian investors actually investing in Zimbabwe. So where I see the opportunity in the future is perhaps Zimbabweans, again in diaspora, investing in a fund like ours to invest in agriculture.
Thank you. Ronald, any insights onto this?
Yes, thank you, Ronald Chochangu from Better Risk. I think that the way I would look at this is in a different way, which is to say, as Zimbabweans, do we ourselves understand where Zimbabwe is? Because whatever you are investing in, you should understand the situation on the ground. So actually, incidentally, I've just sort of been in Zimbabwe for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I think it's very different when you go back home, and you see it for yourself, So what I would say is I would describe what's happening in Zimbabwe right now, and then say to those in the diaspora, try to relate where you are and where you fit into the value chain and how those opportunities work best for you. Because we have, if you think about it, we have up to 5 million Zimbabweans outside Zimbabwe.
Right.
3 of those in South Africa. I think it's almost 1 million here in the UK. Of that, probably 30-40% are children who either came here or grew up here, and the rest are adults, working in places like the NHS. So I think if you're going to Zimbabwe today, you will see 2 or 3 things. From my own experience over the last few weeks, there is sort of 20 to 30% of people, organizations, individuals, institutions where things are normal, in quotes. So
right.
they continue to survive. And then there is, maybe 50 or so, 50, 60% of, individuals, institutions, organizations where things are not working. They're either in arrears or whatever it is. So our view is always to say, understand where you are and where the situation is right now and how best to
Yeah, we'll come back to the depth of that in a moment. Dr. Rob Daniel, any information on how people can drive diaspora funds into Africa and Zimbabwe?
Yeah, as you can probably tell, I'm probably one of the only people on the panel that's not actually a diaspora of Zimbabwe here. So I was working for government. I'm in the business of actually helping to create the diaspora in the first place through foreign offices, funds with education, bringing Zimbabweans over to the UK, educating and then encouraging them to come back. We stress the encouraging to come back bit because quite often that doesn't happen. They come, they like it, even with this weather, they stay. And so encouraging them to come back, and what's really good from my perspective is coming to events like this where people are talking up Zimbabwe.
Sure.
I think most people that I would talk to on a typical day-to-day basis are probably talking it down. Yeah. And so if you're talking, if you want people to come back, you want people to bring their money and bring themselves, then start talking it up. And as we were saying before, it's all about that risk perspective. Right. I would think that of all of the countries in Africa, I mean, Africa is is not going to be the easiest place to do business in the world. I think Zimbabwe is probably on the lower end of the list of 53 countries on that risk scale. So talking it up, I think, is probably where you're going to start.
Yeah. And I guess the gentleman next to you, Batanai, has started talking it up by sponsoring this event. Batanai.
My employer has. So I'll answer the question, I guess, with two hats on. The first is, from a professional point of view, I work for McFarlane's, a law firm, and we are a UK law firm that does a lot of international legal work from here. One of the most surprising things that I found when I joined McFarlane's is that actually we do a lot of work with Zimbabwe. So there's a lot of work that's already going on involving Zimbabwe already. That's quite interesting. But speaking to your question, I think from a sort of legal point of view, I think a platform and structures and confidence, these are the sort of words that come to mind when I think about how we can harness the diasporan capital. I should also mention that, of course, I'm Zimbabwean with a name like Batanai, and so I myself am an investor in the Zimbabwean economy and go there on personal grounds every year. And I think one of the things that I think of when I think about how we can better harness all of this capital is to observe how Zimbabweans in the diaspora in the UK anyway interact with one another when it comes to Zimbabwean businesses here. And one of the encouraging things that I've witnessed is that there is a lot of excitement and support and goodwill that exists among Zimbabwean diasporans, the desire for someone to succeed. And if we can give them that platform with the right structures and the right transparency and confidence, my impression is that we'll see great returns from that.
Sure. We are lucky here today to have a gentleman who is already doing something around diaspora funds. Tafi, can you just explain what your company is doing and perhaps the challenges that you have faced thus far and your successes as well?
Right, thank you. So by way of introduction, I'm a solicitor. I run a small practice in Birmingham. We do mainly immigration work. We do a few other things, but immigration is really our bread and butter. Now, in my line of work, what I've discovered is this, that we have had waves of Zimbabweans coming into the UK, and the main wave would have been around 2001, 2002. So, the average Zimbabwean has been in the UK for that long, about 14, 15 years. Now, over time, the kind of things that Zimbabweans were coming to see us for, at least in my law firm, were for immigration, papers. They wanted to regularize their stay. But the community has evolved, it has matured. And over time, what we've sort of discovered is that there's now an appetite to invest back in Zimbabwe. And so that, conversation began in earnest, at least, as far as I'm concerned, about 5 years ago. And I've had, clients come to me and talk about wanting to invest in Zimbabwe, wanting information about, the legalities and the environment and so on. And this is how this whole concept was birthed. So we then sat, down and created the Zimbabwe Diaspora Investment Group. We came together in a room on the 11th of February this year and put together a bit of money, pledged about 120,000. We're fortunate to have a bit of funding from the UK government. Glad to see a representative here. And the mantra, I think, from the government, the UK government, really is now a focus on trade as opposed to aid.
Yes.
And we wanted to buy into that vision. You know, as diasporans, we didn't want to go to the UK government and say, okay, you know, can you give us a bit of, you know, this and that. We wanted to drive the agenda and say, look, we are here. We know the environment back home. What we need are the tools. You know, if you partner with us, we know the environment, we know the resources. So that's the background.
Yeah.
And perhaps I will explain a bit more in terms of the structure and what.
Yeah, I think that perfectly leads into our next part of the questions. So, what instruments do you see as suitable, and what investment vehicles do you think can actually be utilized in drawing the funds back home? So if you start with Tawia.
I think the something like the consolidated fund is something that actually would work. So I was just having a chat at the break time about it and how it works in practice in terms of larger investments, because I suppose it's all well and good consolidating the money and investing in smaller investments, but when you're talking about the large-scale commercial agribusinesses, for example, how would that actually work in practice? So that's a challenge I have.
I'm thinking more of the source of the fund here. We have about 5 million, as Ronald mentioned, Zimbabweans. We also have, you know, wealthy individuals. I'm thinking of the source to say, which source would be most suitable in order to harness these kind of funds, you know, to bring them up into something that is fruitful.
So there's a combination of, so there's individuals I work with personally who are running money for large organizations. So that's a good source. So one of the key things in money management, and Ronald will tell you, is it's all about reputation. And a lot of the people invest in you. So it's, you know, I know Ronald, and Ronald may be able to access $10, $15 million to invest in something that improves the lives of ordinary people in Zimbabwe.
Right. Ronald, your view on that?
No, good. I agree. I guess maybe, you know, just by way of background. So my background is on the institutional side. So I spent 10 years at UBS working across capital markets, investments, and risk management. So I'm most recently in insurance. So I'm one of these people who's seen the view of the world from the institutional side. But I think tying into the two comments and the question in terms of the panel right now, I think part of it is Zimbabwean diaspora capitalizing themselves, because it's one thing to just send money. Right now, the official numbers from the last time I checked, I think it's around 2 to 3 billion recorded. Obviously, there is more because individuals travel, of money from the diaspora that is going into Zimbabwe through official channels, so World Remit, MoneyGram, and so forth, to support Zimbabweans at home right now, and that's families, that's businesses, and so forth. But I think if, as diaspora, we combine the views from the fund and so forth, and you take a step back and you define yourself as a source of ideas and capital, because because of the experiences we've had in these developed markets, we have ideas and intellectual capital that if we were to send those at home through our network, they would be able to accelerate even more.
Right. I'll come on to the intellectual capital a little bit later. But for now, Dr. Rob, maybe you can just expand on that part of the investment capital.
And I think when it comes down to it, it's probably the big issue is probably the number of different types of instruments available. I mean, when you're looking at the subject here, we're talking about diaspora. And if I take an analogy with a sector I know very well in new tech and startups, and I was taking that from a comment that was made before about Zimbabwe is effectively a new startup economy. At the beginning of every startup, you get capitalized by family, friends, and fools. And the diaspora is the family here. Zimbabwean diaspora, or whether it's Indian or is it India or wherever, that diaspora is pretty much going to invest back in the home country, whatever. They are determined to, regardless of whether or not it's a great investment, but because they feel duty-bound to do it. And so the fact that they do what they
Still,
do...
does patriotism actually work on this? I'm thinking if one is an investor, they're going to be seeking the highest returns. Perhaps not necessarily just investing just for their sake, for their country, to raise the flag, but they want to make a return out of it.
The bank of mum and dad is not necessarily looking at the biggest returns. They are looking to invest in their own futures. Anything above that, then yes, they then will take a much more sort of closer view as to what the returns are. But diaspora, I would say, probably on the whole, are investing with their eyes shut when it comes into whatever the country is, because that's they're giving back to whatever it is.
Batanai, your take on the investment vehicles?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo the comments of everyone who's just spoken on this point. I think, to my mind, when I think about it, you have the attractiveness of fund-type structures is quite clear to me. And the reason for that is a lot of the capital in the hands of diasporans, this is my observation, there's no sort of scientific sort of assessment of this, is in the form of discretionary income. So it's what you can spare and send back. And the question is, when you're then thinking, how do I make the most of this and try and invest, you come up against, not having sufficient liquidity to make investments on a scale that makes sense. And I think that is a problem that faces a lot of people in the diaspora. And so if you provide the structures and the platforms to enable people to invest at levels that they're comfortable with, but are able to see a clear sort of link to those returns, then my thinking is that you probably start to get more traction.
Sure. Tafi, how did you settle on the investment? You described the investment vehicle that you came up with. How did you settle on that? Presumably you considered many avenues in order to come up with that.
So we had some very interesting conversations, and I mean, one particular conversation that sticks to the mind is one I had with my MP, who happened to be the previous Secretary for International Development, so Mr. Mitchell, MP for Southern Coldfield. And he says this, he says, look, you can go knocking on doors, and looking for funds to invest in Zimbabwe, and good luck with that. Those were his words. You're not likely to get very far unless you can mobilize yourselves first, and create some kind of fund, however small, but use that fund to leverage, and there is money out here. But as long as you can demonstrate that you are organized, there is some investment on your part, there is some buy-in, and it's not, this way is exact words, it's not a widows and orphans fund. Being a Tory, you would say that. But there is money here, but I think the bottom line is people want to see your commitment first. And so this is what we did. We came together, put a bit of money to, like I said, £100,000. It's not a lot, in the grand scheme of things, but it's a starting point, we think. And our idea is that, if we invest, particularly in the residential, property market, and then build a portfolio over time, we think over 2-3 years it can be done to build a sizable portfolio, and then use that as leverage, from here, access the capital markets, and then do the bigger projects that we have in mind.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to open to the floor. If anyone has any questions, just as we wait for questions, you mentioned residential, and I think an important consideration as well is from you panelists. What sort of sectors do you think are likely to be the destinations for such investment capital?
For me, it's quite simple. It's the agricultural value chain. having operated in Zimbabwe, looking at a farm that was once, breadbasket of that area in Chegrutu, to a farm that had the local villagers traveling 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers to go and find work, earn $2 a day, and then spend that dollar to come back home and then keep the dollar. To me, it didn't make any sense. So the work that we did was to keep those workers in those communities, develop those communities, gain commitment and trust from those workers, and then from there you start to gain the traction locally. And with that, you get your good harvest, you get your returns, your investors are happy, and for me, that's where the future lies.
Sure.
I think just making sure we stick to the main theme of the panel, which is we want to get to 100 billion, okay?
Right.
So how do we get to 100 billion? So when we look at Ghana and Korea, South Korea, at independence, there was the same size economies. Look at South Korea today and where Ghana is. So I think for me, the technology sector is where most of the capital is going to grow. And Zimbabwe has been blessed with historically a government that's focused on education. A lot of our people are educated, they are eager to work. So I think we have to look at sectors where in the long run, capital is going to grow the most. And for me, that's going to be in technology, harnessing the expertise of our people in Zimbabwe, but then the diaspora all over who have had access to all of these big global companies. That's how we're going to create a 100 billion economy.
Right. Dr. Rob? Yep.
Yeah, he just stole my idea. But to follow on that, billion-dollar economy, there are certain elements to what constitutes a billion-dollar economy, and the infrastructure of an economy, and IT being one of them, particularly in this day and age. There are a number of others. Zimbabwe already has the education system. It's fantastic. I think a couple of things they're missing is probably energy and healthcare, and those things. I think as much as, who was it that said there's only two things that are certain in life, death and taxes. I think before death, ill health is going to get you.
Yeah.
So the healthcare sector in any advanced, developed economy, healthcare is going to always be a major factor.
Well, I think you stole my idea to say Ron stole his idea. So I think what they've both said is spot on. From McFarlane's point of view, we see a lot of investment in tourism, actually. And I think that's the unspoken big story and a story of potential in Zimbabwe, because, tourism could be quite big. And if you consider what the ambassador was saying earlier about the fact that we don't have enough beds, we haven't really established enough infrastructure to really capture the tourism opportunity, I see that as an area that the diaspora could really exploit. It's also relatively easy to get into that market and doesn't necessarily have the same sort of capital barriers that others may have. So I see that as being quite interesting. One other sort of comment on here, just tying in with the points just raised, is I think one thing I like about technology, health, services, tourism, is these are sorts of sectors that the diasporan can not only contribute in terms of liquid capital, but can also contribute in terms of skills, ideas, and all these sorts of things that I think lie untapped, frankly, in terms of what we can bring to the table.
Right.
Yeah, and I think I just want to take up from that last point there in terms of the community, the diaspora community. I don't have statistics, but a large percentage of people that are in the UK are in the health sector, either nurses or doctors. And there's a trend that's developed recently where a lot of Zimbabweans have gone into being, care provider entrepreneurs. So they're running, care companies, and it's a massive, massive trend. So there's scope there. And I'll give you an example. We're looking at an opportunity in Harare. This was a 20-bed private hospital on the market for $200,000. As advertised. But like someone said in here, these are headline figures. When you then talk to these people, and you put in an offer, it can actually be 50% of what's actually on the market. So low-hanging fruit, as someone I think coined the phrase. So healthcare definitely, agriculture I think we've put down as a key area, real estate, and there's an area that a lot of people don't talk about, but which is massive, and for Zimbabweans we've just got to beat the drum, the arts. And in these troubled times in Zimbabwe particularly, that sector has just been booming. So there's scope for investment in that area. And then lastly, education. There's liberalization going on, so private providers can go in and build schools, and provide a service. So opportunities there.
Okay. So, but if you look at one of our key challenges in terms of competitiveness as a nation is actually on infrastructure. Do you think from diaspora resources, we can amass the amount of capital that is needed, in excess of billions mostly, to fund our infrastructure and hence enhance our competitiveness?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible, and it goes back to Tafi's point on leveraging what you already have. So you definitely need to demonstrate that commitment to do something and then be able to leverage that for bigger funds to invest in Zimbabwe.
So when you look at infrastructure is quite wide. Let's look at sort of transport infrastructure, power generation, and so forth. I think part of this is the local story. I think there are great examples which I would echo from His Excellency the Ambassador. Power, there's a lot of interesting things happening in power. A great example when I was here, which was announced, was the Old Mutual project. I think this was in sort of Chipinge. And again, that's a small plant that's doing 1.5 megawatts, but it can power the whole of Chipinge. So I think for me, infrastructure is what needs to happen locally in terms of, securing capital, but also there's an expertise story. There's a lot of Zimbabweans in places like, we've talked about the NHS, but places like in health, National Rail, places like that, where if some of those individuals could find a way of contributing to companies back home to boost expertise, that would accelerate the infrastructure story a lot further. And then obviously on the transport side, I think everybody has reiterated that on the road, on rail side, but even air, there is opportunity for more players. If you go to Harare International right now, you're going to be very surprised how many African airlines are there as you enter. If Ethiopian Airways are sending a 777 from Addis, what more needs to be done globally to improve that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think when you look at infrastructure, maybe assuming that the diaspora is going to make a big dent in the capital requirements for infrastructure is probably putting too much pressure on the 5 million out there. Better actually to use a diaspora as the vanguard of finance into Zimbabwe, but building a good, strong, stable economy where rule of law is paramount will ensure that the vanguard is then followed up by standard capital from the rest of the world, from institutional investors, not having to rely on the family friends bit.
Yes.
That's the way to do it, and having the diaspora as that vanguard is the key to doing it.
Yeah, so basically you're saying it has to work in tandem with other FDI as well. Okay, but...
I'll probably echo Ron's comments, because I don't think the diaspora can realistically be expected to do big ticket infrastructure projects, right? So I think, setting realistic targets and seeing where we can really contribute is useful. I do think, however, that two immediate opportunities exist. The Honourable Ambassador said about power generation, for example, and thinking about doing smaller type projects. Yes, that's achievable today by the diaspora. I also think the diaspora can piggyback off influencing the government to do those big ticket type things that allow the diaspora to then follow in and make those investments more meaningful. So you build a really big road east to west. In and of itself, that's not as powerful as if the diaspora then come in and follow up with growth points or whatever it is that's necessary to sort of make that big ticket infrastructure project worthwhile. One final point on this is, I think from an influence point of view, I think from when you talk about infrastructure, I think the diaspora could probably put a lot more pressure for more regional type projects that bring benefits on a much bigger scale to be brought to bear. So let's dream about that fast rail connection between Joburg Airport and Harare Airport, and let's forget about trying to get there all the time. This sort of thing I think could really help us.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's about, the word I want to use is credibility. So if as a community, and I'm talking from the viewpoint of our organization, ZIDIC, if we can deliver on one project, however small it is, and then, use that to market on a bigger project, I think it can be done. And then there's another way that it could actually be done, and I was talking to, sorry, I forget, Kay, yes. And as an idea, say there is a big project happening in Zimbabwe, and then whether it's a private developer or the government developing it, and then they say, we are allocating 30% equity in this project to diaspora. And then on the basis of that document, or on the basis of that undertaking, you come to the diaspora and you waive that document. I think it can be done.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it draws me into another topic I was going to discuss. And what you're saying is similar to diaspora bonds. But when you look at it, actually, only India and Israel have thus far been able to successfully launch those. And I think Nigeria only recently just successfully launched that. So in terms of Zimbabwe, and I'm going to put this question to the panelists, what do you think needs to happen in order to succeed where other countries have seemingly failed despite having huge diaspora populations as well?
My view is a perception one. I think there's a lot of misperceptions on where the money goes. I think an example that I frequently cite is that of Thailand. So Thailand, since 1932, has had about 12 military coups, and they still manage to attract $5 to $6 billion of FDI every single year. Why is that? And tourists still flock to Bangkok, Laos, and so forth. So why does Thailand attract foreign direct investment still? So for me, that remains an open question.
I think there's two things to say. If we look at infrastructure, let's look at traded infrastructure and sort of unlisted infrastructure. Even here in the UK, there will be companies like Greencoat and so forth who have listed infrastructure portfolios. And I think if you look at what's happening on the JSE in South Africa, and I'm sure it might start happening closer to home, if we can get certain infrastructure projects that are diversified and so forth, that are listed, which means they have buy-in from local institutional investors, it will attract more money from the diaspora. In tandem, some of those funds could also then list debt instruments because A, the portfolio is visible, B, the equity itself is more liquid. So I think following on from South Africa, you will see that in Zimbabwe move forward. So I think that's already in motion. And I think the second point that ties into your diaspora bonds point, I think part of that is, and I think Rob mentioned this, there's kind of sort of stakeholder confidence building. And I think starting with the smaller projects and specific things that are tied to funding key deliverables on a smaller basis will build up that trust that you need to invest more.
Dr. Rob?
Yeah, I think when you want to sort of compare with what happened in India and Israel and maybe China as well, is look at, when you say there's 5 million diaspora from Zimbabwe, I don't think the number's that important, it's the who. If you look in particular India, where I spent 3 years out there, the Indian government had a positive program of pushing out their best into the world. And at one point in 2005 when I was there, we used to say to people all the time that 75% of the CEOs of Silicon Valley were Indian. They did that deliberately, and they're now reaping the rewards of that program. rather than just people, just economic migrants, just going willy-nilly out into the world. The government actually had a game plan, and that's why you were seeing. Same with Israel, same with China.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we can learn lessons from what happened in Israel and India, but at the same time, I don't think we should be too negative about the fact that we haven't done that necessarily. Just because that was right for them doesn't necessarily mean that that would be the way we would do it here. I think the diaspora community here would be very specific with its specific needs in terms of what it sees as being the sorts of instruments it can invest in. And I think where you start, whatever the instrument you choose, ultimately you come down to confidence, right? And whatever we can do to increase transparency and confidence, even if it's a misperception point, that for me is the starting point towards success.
Yeah.
Yes, I think for me it comes down again to, that word I use, credibility. In the past, there was a program that was pushed by the Zimbabwean government to, attract diaspora funds through a program which they called HomeLink, where diasporans could invest in a property, back home. That didn't quite work. And there is a perception amongst diasporans that, if at all a similar program were to be rolled out again, it's mainly meant to perhaps fund recurrent expenditure,
Yes.
and not necessarily developing the infrastructure. So there is that perception. And I think the way around it is to outsource. So whatever program the government might want to come up with, especially in terms of maybe a bond of some sort or whatever other instrument might be mooted, I think the solution would be to outsource it to private players, and particularly those that are best in the diaspora. It has to be led from the diaspora, not from the other end.
Not from the other end. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to just pick up one
Sure.
point on that, which I think, a lot of the comments I've made have been around, creating platforms, space, transparency, all these sorts of things, which tend to be, sort of government-targeted type things.
Yeah.
But I also think, just to sort of be fair, diasporans ourselves, we need to, at the end of the day, make some decisions and invest. And not lose out. I mean, the stuff that Ron was saying right at the beginning, I was saying he's been there for 3 weeks, seeing things, you're seeing the same Zimbabwe, but when you're on the ground, actually there, dealing with things, your perception and perspective changes. And all I'm saying is that there is a lot of stuff that can be done to create platforms and opportunities, but ultimately, diasporans need to. Yeah.
I think the last point that I wanted to discuss today was on, if you see over the past years in Zimbabwe, we had a lot of brain drain. And most of these skills are in diaspora, I think, as you can see. And no matter how much funds come into Zimbabwe, if you don't have the skills, if you don't have the expertise, it amounts to nothing. So what I want to extract from you is what strategies should the government be employing, in order to attract the skills and the intellectuals in order to execute some of the strategies and programs that we are discussing here.
That point resonates very strongly with me because in running our agricultural business, one of the biggest challenges was not the weather, was not the risk, was not politics, wasn't anything. It was the people. The people were not capable at a managerial level to be able to run operations confidently. So we had to insource some of that expertise. But what we then did was to start partnering with other commercial farmers who had been doing it for years and sending some of our potential managers to do secondments with these guys, learn the expertise for 2 or 3 months at a time, come back. And then we also ended up sending some of these local young kids with potential to agricultural colleges and schools in Zimbabwe to then hopefully at some point in time, not necessarily work for us, but work for someone else in the industry to help bring up the industry as a whole.
Look, I think the reality on the ground is a little bit different, and I think this is part of the honest conversation and engagement the diaspora needs to have. there is not going to be a red carpet when you arrive. That's the reality. But I think there's 2 or 3 things to say. Number one, there's actually quite a lot of great businesses that are working in Zimbabwe. A good example on the stock exchange is Citco. Citco is a very good company that has leverage on its processes and expertise to expand in the rest of Africa. So if we're going to create a 100 billion economy, I think the diaspora has to appreciate 2 or 3 things. Yes, they have expertise, but in of itself, it's not enough. I think it's your network and your ability to create value through companies of structures that are going to come into Zimbabwe, work with existing companies in Zimbabwe, reconfigure, and for me that's really the key word. You have to reconfigure your expertise, ideas, companies to what is happening in Zimbabwe. A great example is you often hear that 90% of Zimbabweans are unemployed. You go to Zimbabwe right now and you ask yourself, how are things working? It's because a lot of the economy has moved into the SME sector. So tying into your question, government policy now seems to be focused more on the SME sector because that's where a lot of the money is. You go around Harare, there's a lot of informal economy. You're starting to hear about informal pension products, insurance products, all of these things. So if you're in the diaspora, regardless of whether you have money, ideas, or whatever it is, part of this conversation is reconfiguring in terms of what's happening on the ground. Because it's a very different economy now.
Right.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? You know, how do you turn a brain drain into a brain gain? And the first thing to remember is actually don't turn off that tap. You know, you need that drain so that you can gain. But really, is that how do you get them to come back again afterwards? I remember a time in Bangalore, actually, where the government was trying to get everybody to come back. It's interesting, the expectations of diaspora are sky high. They've gone away, they've been away for 15 years, whatever, they're coming back and they're expecting that the red carpet has been laid out for them. And the most likely person to complain about the conditions in Bangalore at the time was not some pasty Brit or Americans, it was the diaspora that had come back. And so, you know, it's not necessarily how do you get them to come back, it's how do you get them to come back and stay. And you do want them to stay. It's not just the money that you want, it's that knowledge that they have gained from being out there. There are lots of different schemes I've seen around the world. Malaysia is one that comes to me where the big tax credits, and I think that we're even giving people a car if they came back and they stayed for 5 years, they got a car. People are staying for 5 years, getting their car and then driving into Singapore and staying there. It's a difficult one. How do you get them to stick when they come back?
I think there's a question.
Hello, my name is Gloria.
There's the mic.
Thank you. I think it's refreshing to hear people look at the positive potential in Zimbabwe because all too often we focus on all the negativity, and I think that's the biggest issue, especially for us as Zimbabweans. We tend to market our country in a negative way, and people actually other people from other countries see the potential. But my question to the panel is, I think it's all good for us to sit here and have this discussion and have this platform about diasporans investing back. I think the difficulty is having access to that information. The information that we're sharing here, a lot of diasporans do not have access to that. A lot of diasporans are actually naive about how to be able to even start the process of investing, but the passion is there. So my question is, how can we create these platforms where the diasporans can actually engage, be able to be given this information, and be able for them to be given that opportunity to ask the kind of questions, because not everybody can attend these kind of events. So I just would like to just hear some ideas from you. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I would just conscious of time, so guys, if we can just have a minute each of just winding up and addressing a question.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of communities of Zimbabweans in different cities in the UK. I think it's important to keep having these conversations within these communities. I think there's a lot of reaching out that also needs to be done by the informed, if I call it that. So I think maybe sometimes we're too insular and we we're inward looking and not realize that there's potentially other people out there who may be interested in investing back in Zimbabwe in some shape or another.
Look, I think the answer to the question is in the question that there is a business opportunity, and it is for Zimbabweans. I know other people similar to what Tafi is doing, who have gone not just around Zimbabwe but around Africa looking for these opportunities, creating a framework where you can do the due diligence and you get all the stakeholder buy-in. So I think if people are seeing these gaps, the only way that things can change is for people to take on the entrepreneurial aspect, the risk, as it were, to go out there to create the necessary frameworks and getting the institutional buy-in, which is going to be key for the credibility to allow this conversation to move forward. So there's a business opportunity right there for people to take on.
Yeah, if I may, I'll go back to what I said right at the beginning, and it's the talking it up bit. I think there are lots of vehicles out there to engage, whether it's through forums like this, websites like that, whether it's through UK government or whatever. There's lots of stuff out there. My question is actually probably whether or not the large majority of those diaspora are even looking. My sense is that particularly the diaspora that's in the UK has probably got its head down doing its day job, just trying to make a buck. And hasn't actually considered whether or not Zimbabwe does represent a good investment opportunity at all. And is probably thinking about trying to buy the second home in London somewhere. So actually talking it up will lift their heads up a little bit and say, well, okay, maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe I should investigate further. And then once they do that, then the whole world opens up in front of them.
I think, I think diasporans are probably looking at Zim all the time, thinking how to get in. But I also think there is something to be said about celebrating our success stories, right? So, if you know someone and you can see and point to that, then that's the way forward. But ultimately, I think, us creating the opportunities for ourselves and harnessing them is the way forward. Right.
Yeah, so talking about opportunity, in terms of our platform, that's what we're trying to do really. So the model is to invest as a group, but parallel to that, and to piggyback on that, we've got this portal where opportunities, or rather businesses in Zimbabwe, can post their opportunities on the portal, and then people out here can access those opportunities. So that's where we. But I just want to pick up on something that he says, in terms of institutional buy-in, because that's what gives credibility to the portal. Yeah. So perhaps this is a pitch to institutions that are here, if you want to come in and support our model. But that's where we are focused, to give information on the portal for investors to buy in.
I'll take two more questions before we. Oh, three, okay.
My question is scalability. Everything looks good until you want to scale it up. 100 billion has been circulated for a long time now. My good friend Kenya Smufukuzi put together the CEO roundtable and said our economy would be 100 billion by 2020, which is now impossible. How long do you see a $100 billion economy with or without the support of the diaspora? Is the first question, and linked to that is the platform that you talk about. How many people are we talking about? How do we find access to these diasporans? There could be hundreds of thousands, there could be millions. Surely there's some way of collecting that data, and there's an opportunity for that. I mean, for us, the access to that data is valuable. Who and how, when is that going to happen?
Right. Shall we just take the other question, and then you can just address the...
It's not a question, but I think it's a very interesting topic, which probably needs a panel of its own, but I'll just make a few very quick comments. So we were in India recently, and this diaspora thing is a huge animal. I mean, India gets approximately $20 to $30 billion per month. $1 billion from the Gulf. Yeah. So it's massive. Now, and it's tapped in a particular way. So I don't think it can be adequately covered now, but I'll just make a few quick comments. The thing with Zimbabwe is that you have a large population outside floating, and they're not contributing back. Now, there's 2 or 3 million Zimbabweans in South Africa, for example, who can make a huge contribution. The point I'm making is that as Gerudo Capital, people come to us to raise money often, and we go to institutions to raise money. And I can tell you, and probably, and I've had to explain this to the Zimbabwean government on at least 1 or 2 occasions, including ZB Bank and a couple of other banks. 1 or 2 of the largest fund managers globally are Zimbabweans. They're known, Zimbabweans are known to be clever people, well-educated. There's a lot of them around. But it hasn't been properly organized, it hasn't been properly structured, and that's what it needs.
Sure.
My contribution is that what you should do is utilize this diaspora contact, idea rather. There's a large number of people, but get into a formalized, proper structure, and get 1 or 2 of these brilliant Zimbabwean minds who run these huge portfolios, and I can give you the names of those people, to head it up. And what's important is the jockey. The success of these things is who's the jockey and who's going to run it, who's going to deliver the returns, who do people identify with. And they should be upright, ethical, decent people, clever people, and you have them. That's the trick. And there's 2 people in London. They're controlling massive amount of funds. It's quite amazing that they're not coming forward. It's quite amazing that no one's reaching out to them. And this is what somebody needs to do. Somebody needs to do it, and as you said earlier, it's a great business opportunity for somebody to seize on.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your words. Do we want to take the last one here before you, then you guys just answer one issue.
So my name is David Ziambi from Latham & Watkins. We're an international law firm similar to Batanai. Basically, there are 2 things that I think with the Zimbabwe question that strike me. One is that most of what's been done in the country has been done without debt. The debt portion of what's done in Zimbabwe is negligible. And that is not how any economy on the planet, any successful economy functions. So there is significant upside in simply setting up structures that allow debt to come into the country. And that's something that we have actively been doing for a while for other African countries, and there are various ways that you can structure around political risk and credit risk, whether it be currency risk, etc. That can actually help the situation. And until you engage with the institutional investors, your diaspora is only going to help you marginally. So I think 5 million people in the diaspora, if every one of them with the best will was to contribute £1,000 every month, we still wouldn't be in a position where we get to 100 million. I think that for me is clear. Yeah. So you have to engage with the institutionals, and to get that, you have to get a safe environment for investing. And if that can't be done in Zimbabwe, then you structure your deals outside of Zimbabwe, and you allow for cash flows to be paid outside of Zimbabwe. The second thing is, we, as Zimbabweans, we are almost obsessed with Zimbabwe as a country alone. Zimbabwe is a landlocked country that has to cooperate with all the countries around it.
Sure.
SADC is the goal. I have to reiterate, SADC is the goal. Without interacting with the rest of the countries, size-wise, we will never compete with the likes of West Africa. Nigeria has 200 million people. If I'm going to invest as a foreign investor in Africa, with all its issues, Nigeria to me says, if I can get 10% of those 200 million people to buy, I've made 20 million if I sell it for $1 an item. We have that problem. Zimbabwe is only 13 million people. How do you actually leverage without looking outside of our borders for volume? I think that's something that we have to think of realistically. And we have the brain power, we have the professionalism. We can easily do cross-border ventures, which actually give us a bigger market and we can grow the cake. So for me, it's cooperation and debt. I think those are the two keys.
Well, some profound words there from the floor. So your last comments, gentlemen.
Can I just add to what David was saying and just touch on what Ken as well said? I completely agree. Terms in our view is a portfolio approach, and the view of our investments and the future of Africa is looking at sub-Saharan Africa. Institutional investors want to look at that portfolio and think, what's my volatility? And the only way you're going to manage that volatility is to have different assets in that portfolio. And so Zimbabwe alone, as an investment on its own in a portfolio, is not potentially going to get us to $100 billion. But once we leverage that expertise, as well as use some of our soft power that we have as diaspora out here, we can create these structures that change perception for investment into Zimbabwe.
Thank you. Ronald?
Look, I think these are all great ideas, but I guess ultimately it's in the implementation and what's going to work in the short to medium and long term. I think it's clear, I'm sure, from a government perspective, all of this informs a policy that needs to be developed and sustained over time. So I think that view is clear. But I think there's then also an individual view in terms of where do you fit into this much bigger microcosm. Obviously, you've seen a lot of Zimbabwean companies come to the diaspora, sell life insurance, savings products. Actually, HomeLink apparently is still live, and a lot of people have been able to buy property. So I think there's a lot of moving parts, and I think we should be informed for the much bigger long-term game by the question of institutional credibility. And institutional credibility is going to need a debt story. So David's point is very clear around that. Institutional credibility is going to need safeguards and all of these moving parts that no individual in the diaspora can resolve. Yep. But I think we can learn a lot of lessons as well from South Africa and India who've tried to do some work around that path.
Yeah.
Just want to make 2 points. One before, how do we go out and link the 5 million or so diaspora together? I think technically it's easy to do that. If my dog can have 10,000 followers on Instagram, you can easily tomorrow link all 5 million. I think somebody just needs to get out there and do it, right? Or at least 3 or 4 people. So I don't think that's necessarily the problem. And then there's the other point on seeing Zimbabwe just as Zimbabwe, and actually it's a very good point. One of the issues that we have trying to encourage companies to look at Africa in general or Zimbabwe is this fact, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, the big mantra was Africa is not a country. Right? And actually I want to turn that on its head. Actually, my biggest problem is that it's not a country. It's 54 separate countries that are in equally difficult investment markets in their own right. Africa is competing with India and China. And I've been to India, it's 26 different countries, actually, just with one government at the top of it. It's an incredibly difficult place to do business in. But when you do, it's big. I helped a company go from 0 sales to 150,000 within 3 months. You don't get that in a particular country in Africa. The Nokia was selling 9 million mobile phones a month in India at the time when I was there. You don't get that in Zimbabwe or just a Nigeria. It's fundamental that Africa organizes its internal trade and it's blocked. I think it less than 15% of trade in Africa is internal. Everything's going out. So sorting that out actually will encourage everybody to come in and support.
Batanai, quick words.
I think I'm encouraged by the opportunity that exists. I'm encouraged by the activity, at least from a law firm point of view, what we're seeing in terms of the appetite on the part of investors to get into Zimbabwe. Speaking specifically about the diaspora community, I think at the end of the day, whether or not the conditions are rosy for us, we should just engage. Whatever your level of engagement, whichever way it is, somewhere, somehow, do something. And my sense is by getting busy doing these things, you just see change happen because that becomes a catalyst to other things and other things and so forth and so on.
Sure. Lastly, Tafi.
Yes. So the way I look at Zimbabwe is this: that it's like you say, an incredibly difficult place to run a business. So I'm invested in Zimbabwe in a microfinance institution, very difficult environment, but somehow we've managed to make it work. And the way I look at things is this: if you can make it work in Zimbabwe, you can make it work anywhere else. So Zimbabwe for me is a launchpad.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. That brings an end to our discussion. A round of applause to our panelists.